Mount Everest, also known as Sagarmatha in Nepal and Koh Longma in Tibet, is well known around the world for its extreme height, standing today at 29,031.69 feet or 8,848.86 meters. But Earth is not a perfect sphere. There are 29 peaks across the world that stretch further from the center of the Earth than Everest. One of these mountains lies on the other side of the planet, deep within the western Andes of Peru. Despite being located in the tropic region inside of the Amazon basin, this peak, which rises to 22,205 feet or 6,768 meters within the Cordillera Blanca, the White Mountain Range, is covered in ice year-round. This is Huascarán, also called Merarayu, meaning snow peak, the tallest mountain in Peru. Sitting directly beside it is another mountain, its twin, Huandoy. Incan oral histories of these two peaks tell of a vengeful sun god, Inti, who, upon learning of his daughter Huandoy's mortal lover, Huascarán, turns them both into mountains, separated by a cold blue lake of their tears. This legend, a story of love and loss, is not the only tragedy to strike Huascarán. It takes 7 days to climb to its peak, and has claimed the lives of many people who've dared to make the trek. And on June 26, 2025, Huascarán would claim another life, that of an experienced climber, doctor, and mother who came all the way from Japan to summit its peak. Welcome to Stick and Stone. I'm Sydney, and this is my first episode, and as you can tell, this is mainly a podcast about climbing, but I love to knit. And so I thought this would be something fun to make because I love to listen to audiobooks and podcasts while I knit. So this is for the knitters out there who love to be outside and can't sit still for very long. Before we get into it, I have to talk about the alpacas in Peru. I've always been in love with the culture and history of Peru. They've got mummies preserved in all kinds of ways with drying, salting, freezing, and beer. They have burnished pottery vases shaped like birds that whistle when water is poured out of them, and obviously alpacas. Alpaca fleece are mainly used for weaving over there. I'm sure there's a lot of knitters now, but historically they're known for weaving, and they've got these incredible, super colorful hand-woven clothes. Their chulo hats and ponchos are probably the most well-known and recognizable because they've been picked up and worn in high fashion. But they've got probably the prettiest cold weather clothing for high altitude clothes you can find. I feel like there's so much of the outdoorsy mountain style here that's really drab, and there's a lot of plastic in it, even though it's lighter and that has advantages. The traditional Andean wear reminds me more of stuff like the Fair Isle sweaters from Scotland with all the colors and patterns. I especially love that they created, I don't know how to say this, yiklas, which are basically the baby Bjorns that fit with their wardrobe. So their whole outfit always goes together even when they have this Bjorn on. And being made out of alpaca and sometimes sheep wool too, the clothes are water resistant, sweat wicking, hard wearing, relatively light for their size, and most importantly, they're insulating. There's a lot of cities and villages up in the mountains there where the temperatures fall roughly between 34 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1 to 14 degrees Celsius most of the year, so it stays pretty cool. And I'm a Texan, so those are winter temperatures for us during the 2-week window when I can actually wear my wool sweaters, unless I'm indoors like now. I honestly wear them year-round, but that's only because there's AC everywhere here, and I get super cold, especially my body goes from feeling hot but normal and I feel fine in 90-degree heat to a suddenly 68-degree room with the shades pulled down, and it is so cold. One of the fibers that I like to use in my sweaters is baby alpaca. I think this one I actually made with like a baby yak, so not quite the same, but very soft fiber. It's really soft and fluffy, and it's usually spun on a strand of silk that's really thin. I hold this strand of yarn with a thicker strand of wool yarn of the same color, and together it makes a sweater that's thick and warm, but also has this halo of fluffy alpaca fiber hairs. The silk is great too because it adds some structure and durability to the fabric. It's basically like making your own blend of yarn, but the kind that they use in Peru for clothing is usually adult alpaca fleece, which is more like wool from a sheep. And the traditional dyes are from natural plants and sometimes bugs, like the cochineal, which we have in Texas too. They live on the prickly pears here, and these little white nests. And when these bugs or their eggs are crushed, they have this bright red liquid that will absolutely stain anything it touches. This is where carmine dye comes from. It's used in red number 4 coloring for food coloring, which is not gross, but some people are allergic to it. Like, you can be allergic to anything. And it was even used to dye the original British redcoats. I did not know that. The Zapotec people of Mesoamerica actually made these tiny basket tubes that they'd hang on the cacti, so the cochineal would nest inside of them and be easier to harvest. So basically, the Zapotec put out bug-sized birdhouses, like a bug condominium. And that's just one of the dyes that they use in Peru. I'm sure a lot of manufactured dyes exist now too, but that's the only method they had before the factory dyes. These alpacas are raised in the Peruvian highlands up in the Andes, and they have a really large range they can live in, but they're well adapted to the mountain climate and lower oxygen. So my guess is that they moved around to get away from predators and adapted to living up higher, kind of like mountain goats. They're related to camels and their wild cousins, the vicuña or guanaco, who live in the same region and have been interbred with some of the alpacas. And if you're wondering what the wild ones look like and you don't know what alpacas look like, they're pretty similar. Imagine a deer crossed with a camel with a little more hair, and that's kind of what they look like. They're related to llamas too, but alpaca fleeces are way softer, which is why they're better known for their fiber and textiles. The vicuña species is as soft as cashmere, apparently, cashmere comes from a goat originally found in the Himalayas, but they're not domesticated as alpacas, so the vicuñas are wild. They're probably not as tame, but I don't really know why vicuñas haven't been bred more, but I would love to try knitting with a vicuña yarn someday because I've seen that they do exist out there, and I just think that would be really fun. I would definitely want to make one of the chulo hats out of it from, like the traditional kind. And if you've ever made a scarf or a hat out of a scratchy rustic wool, or somebody's given you like a not very soft handmade knit, you'll know that it's just like awful when that fabric is rubbing against your face or your neck. So I feel like that would the vicuña being so soft would make the perfect hat yarn. Anyway, I digress. Alpacas are amazing, but we've got a story to tell. Maybe you're at home listening to this, or maybe you've gotten to your camp set up and you're snuggling into your cozy tent and you're plugging in your earbuds to keep out the sound of mosquitoes buzzing in your ears. Wherever you are, settle in, get out your sticks, and let's turn over some stones. Born in Tokyo in 1984, Chiaki Inada was never afraid of adventure. Since college, she was drawn into mountaineering. A born climber, Chiaki felt the most alive when she was high up, hundreds of feet off the ground, on a cliff face, overlooking the beauty of a natural landscape far, far below. She spent all of her free time preparing for ascents, in the gym challenging herself on bouldering problems, and outside on local boulders and walls. In 2003, she entered the National Defense Medical College in Tokorozawa, a city in a prefecture just northwest of Tokyo. In their rigorous 6-year program, students are trained to become both medical doctors and military officers. Graduates are posted to an officer candidate training school in one of the 3 forces, the Japan Ground, Maritime, or Air Self-Defense Force, before they can take the national medical examination. After passing, the new doctors are posted to a 2-year internship in self-defense force hospitals and battalions. During this time, Chiaki met Makoto, her future husband. They went on to become founding members of the local mountaineering club. Even after graduating to become a medical officer and plastic surgeon, she and Makoto continued to devote themselves to alpine climbing. In 2018, she retired from the self-defense forces to pursue a new profession that would combine her passion with her schooling. becoming a mountain doctor, which I didn't know was a thing, but I think that sounds so cool. Makoto would continue to serve in the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, focusing on training and research related to low-pressure environments and the mechanisms of altitude sickness, and eventually began mountain medical patrols. In 2022, he retired from the forces as a lieutenant colonel. They would go on to found another organization together, this time a company called Mountain Medical Support. This was Chiaki's dream job. Not only were they medical doctors, helping and supporting people, they could do it in her favorite place in the world, on the highest peaks and most challenging mountains. They offered comprehensive medical services to support climbers' dreams, from the pre-climb training to the post-summit care. Partnering with their network of fellow mountain medical professionals, they collaborated with doctors and hospitals responsible for caring for their climbers, all in an effort to make other people's dreams of high-altitude climbing come true. With so much knowledge in this specialized field, Chiaki, sometimes known as Chipe, I think that's how she said it, and Makoto, known as Pokoma, started a YouTube channel combining their nicknames, Chippeco, to share important information on climbing medicine. But it grew to encompass their mountaineering vlogs, climbing videos, and everything in their lives that related to climbing, including taking their 2-year-old son with them on challenging mountain treks. Now, I don't know Japanese, so I'm not sure what Chipe and Pokoma translate to, but I'm sure their nicknames mean something, or maybe they're shortened versions of the characters in their name. But if you know, please tell me. I would really love to find out what they mean, because I'm curious if those are just names or if they're related to climbing or medicine in some way. So tell me if you know Japanese. In June of 2025, Chiaki and her friend Saki Terada left Japan to begin their Peruvian expedition. She documented their travels from the first day. On June 11th, Chiaki posted an image of a tall glass of cold beer, giving cheers to friends and marking day 0 of the trip. "The journey has finally begun," she wrote. "For a week or two leading up to our departure, I was overwhelmed by a fierce wave of sadness at the thought of being separated from my son for 4 whole weeks. However, when we parted ways this morning, so casually and just like any other day, my mindset completely shifted. Before leaving, I tried explaining to him a couple of times that I would be going to Peru for a long while, though I wasn't sure just how much he could actually grasp. His reactions ranged from, 'I can't stay home alone,' to, 'Mommy, Peru?' Even when I had merely stepped out into the garden for a moment. So in the end, it was a bit touch and go whether he truly understood. 4 weeks from now, my son will surely have grown and changed beyond recognition. Not to be outdone by him, I intend to make the most of my precious 4 weeks to grow and transform just as much myself. And so, off I go on my mountaineering adventure in the Peruvian Andes." The next day, Chiaki and Saki landed in Lima, the capital and largest city in Peru, lying midway down the coast and about an 8.5-hour bus ride from Juarez, the second largest city in the Andes. Over drinks and excited to compare notes, they laid out their pre-climbing strategy and quickly realized that they were totally aligned on everything. After months of planning and years of experience in mountaineering, they were ready to check off another summit from their lists. Their discussion turned to the weather, and they noted that Huascarán was experiencing heavy snowfall that year, leading to frequent and massive avalanches. They reassured one another they would not take any unnecessary risks, knowing how dangerous and unpredictable mountain weather can be, changing in just a few hours from sunshine and blue skies to gray clouds, high winds, and deadly snowfalls. Though the journey ahead was intense and full of dangers, the pair of friends relaxed, enjoying the evening, sipping on their pisco sours and taking in the energy of the city. June 13th, Day 2. Embarking on the long bus ride and bound for the mountains, today they would reach the outer edge of Parque Nacional Huascarán, the national park that protects the central Andes and the surrounding valleys, glaciers, lakes, and wildlife around Peru's tallest peaks. The park spans roughly 840,000 acres and is approximately 93 miles, or 150 kilometers, from north to south, and averages about 16 miles, or 25 kilometers, in width. I think the best way for me to picture this, and also probably the most obnoxious way, is to tell you how many Texas' big it is. Peru is basically twice the size of Texas, and the national park is a bit smaller than the Dallas-Fort Worth area, if you don't include the suburban sprawl, which is so massive, I don't want to think about it. So that should help about the 0.01% of people listening. The park was established on July 1st of 1975, but the mountain it was named for had only been called Huascarán since about 1850, so less than 100 years. It's thought to be named after a nobleman, or possibly after a village at its base called Huasco, which itself is a name from the Quechua word for rope. And I obviously thought that was pretty cool, so I had to mention it. And of course, there's the Incan legend I mentioned in the intro, but I'm sure the names of the mountains have changed a lot over time. And speaking of the intro, I wanted to bring up Everest again. I've mentioned it a couple of times already, and that's because there are a lot of similarities between Huascarán and Everest. They're very big mountains, and they attract a lot of climbers from around the world. And being such large mountains, they have a lot of things in common, from the wildlife to the way people live there to the types of dangers that they present to anyone trying to summit them. It's coming up later, but I just want you to keep that in mind because it's important to the story. The park was also designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. All of these protections were put in place to stop loggers and hunting in the area, where animals such as spectacled bears, vicuñas, yes, the softest alpacas, and condors live, as well as being home to the Queen of the Andes. Now, if you don't know what this plant, the Queen of the Andes, is, I highly recommend stopping to look this up when you can, but I'm going to describe it to you as best I can. If you know what a yucca is, start by picturing that. If you don't know what a yucca looks like either, then try picturing something like a palm tree. And if you don't know what a palm tree is, I am sorry, I cannot help you. Think about the top of the palm tree or the yucca, and imagine that sitting on the ground, and above it is a really tall and thin tower that looks kind of like a pineapple if you stretched it, which is not coincidental. It's actually related to pineapples, this plant. So now that you're picturing this plant, you're probably thinking, that doesn't seem worth protecting. It doesn't sound very cool. You'd be wrong. Everything alive is worth protecting, but also this plant is over 50 feet tall. That's 15 meters. And the best part is that if you look this up on Wikipedia, the picture on the Wikipedia page that they feature to represent this beautiful work of nature is a man standing with his legs kind of far apart in front of the two Queen of the Andes. So there's two of them next to each other, but only one has a tower on it. So my 14-year-old mind is only seeing dick and balls. But I mean, go look for yourself and tell me that's not why Wikipedia decided to use that specific photo. Anyway, the park protects significant cultural areas too, including pre-Incan civilizations. Archaeologists have found agricultural terraces, corrals, roads, dams, water canals, cave paintings, stone tombs, and other artifacts linking the area to ancient peoples. For the geologists out there, which I hope a lot of climbers are, and I know we got a lot of STEM knitters out there too, the Andes were formed from a continental uplift, which is still pushing them even higher today. Uplifts often cause a lot of volcanic activity, which there is a lot of in this area, but specifically around Huascarán there isn't, and that's thought to be because it sits on a flat slab, which is a region where the angle of subduction, that's one tectonic plate slipping underneath another one, is too shallow to create an active earthquake zone. And yet it's also the site of the 1970 magnitude 7.8 quake, so science is not perfect. Last thing I want to mention about the area before we follow Chiaki back there is the environmental threats to the park. As is the same for a lot of parks around the world, Huascarán suffers from a lack of funding. There is a small but growing number of residents inside the park because even though the government tried to make sure the people who originally lived in the area maintain their ownership of land outside the park boundaries, some of them overlap too much with the areas in need of protection. So there's a lot of debates around the effects of infrastructure and tourism, as well as mining inside the park. And because there are glaciers in these mountains, climate change is affecting them and causing changes to the landscape and wildlife. My take on this is that people draw rigid lines to protect an area, but the earth is always changing. And so what we protect and how we protect it is not always going to be the same. Like, if I protect my potted plant, I mean, it's not going to live forever no matter how green my thumb is or isn't. And so if I protect the pot, it's eventually just going to be a pot full of old dirt or some other plant. And hey, maybe something else cool can grow in there, but it's not going to be the one plant that I originally had planted in it. So all that to say, climbing around the mountains is always changing, and the mountain itself is changing. But we're living in a time when our models for predicting these things are not keeping up with how the world is changing. June 14th, Day 3. Chiaki and Saki arrived in Juarez and spent the day stocking up on supplies. They toured around the city, sightseeing, taking a walk through the mercado, and enjoying one of Chiaki's other interests, the incredible food. That night, after they'd finished packing up all the gear, they met up with another friend from Japan, originally from the US, Akira, a trekker and mountaineer who'd actually moved to Juarez to become a guide and married a Peruvian woman with Japanese parents, which I thought was so cute that he was able to find someone else with so much in common. In the morning, they said their goodbyes to Akira and made their way out to begin the acclimatization trek to Laguna Chirap, which is a lake about a day's walk outside the city and lies at an elevation of 14,600 feet or 4,450 meters. So now you're probably wondering how high up Juarez is, and it's 10,013 feet or 3,052 meters, which means they had a pretty big hike ahead of them. And since we're in Peru, that's about the height of the Cataratas Las Tres Hermanas, or the Three Sisters waterfall. I am so sorry, I cannot pronounce any language, in southern Peru, which is the third largest waterfall in the world. And even though that's a big elevation gain, Chiaki and her friend were obviously aware of this, which is partly why they planned to spend the previous day in Juarez to get used to the altitude. And at the end of this trek, there's a granite wall, which they scaled, and it had some exposed sections with fixed change, and it's often slippery because the area receives a lot of rain, but they'd come pretty well prepared and enjoyed the climb up. She checked on her SpO2, or blood oxygen levels, after the climb, and the reading was 92%. Normal is between 95 and 100%, and hypoxia, which is when your cells aren't getting enough oxygen, and if it's severe enough, you start turning blue, happens at about an SpO2 of 90%. So she's definitely not at normal, but when you're at a higher altitude, people say the air is thinner, which means there's less oxygen. And so it's considered okay to be around 90 to 95% at the altitude she's at. And obviously they're very aware of this and checking their levels. I mean, her husband studied hypoxia in school, so they know what to look for as far as altitude sickness and hypoxia. And if you haven't experienced altitude sickness before, it's hard to explain, but you just know what it is. For me, I've felt a bad headache, like a pressure in my head, and this kind of itchiness that made it really, really hard to sleep. That was when I was a teenager and we visited Silverton, Colorado, which is at 3,278 feet or 1,000 meters. And my sister actually threw up in the middle of the night. Now, I don't live very far from sea level here, at least not compared to the mountains, so I can imagine it would take me much, much longer to acclimatize than she's doing in a day. And I'm guessing they prepared months prior with some other high elevation treks because that's just really, really high up there. That night, they took another look at the weather reports and reports about their route. And while the forecast for snow was still uncertain, the route appeared to be clear. After scarfing down some well-earned pizza on the street in a sudden downpour, Chiaki and Saki turned in early and prepared for the long trek ahead. As she looked back through the photos of her day, Chiaki composed what would be her last post. Under pictures of the beautiful landscape, a photo of her national park pass, and snaps of her and Saki at Laguna Chirap, the caption read, "This expedition is expected to last up to 10 days. I plan to enjoy every moment to the fullest." And there were so many times reading these captions that felt like so much foreshadowing of what was to come. And I think about it and I think how I would feel in her place at that time. And there's this little voice for the what ifs. What if this becomes treacherous? What if I don't come back? And I think I would also want to write positive notes to send out into the universe so that the people reading it know that I'm thinking what they're thinking. And my last post or whatever the last thing is that they'll read, at least until I can, or if I can post again, is how much I love life and how much I'm living it right now. A lot of people call social media aspirational, but I think it could be really hopeful. And it's not always that people are boasting. That's really more of like a perspective on it. And it's something I know I feel when I'm feeling low and jealous. But they're most of the time normal people sharing the most meaningful and beautiful parts of their lives. And I really love that that's something Chiaki has left for the world. All of her climbing photos and videos and lots of pictures of food and photos of her family. That's what I love being able to take away from this, because I didn't know her. I'm not even from the same country, the same part of the world, but I found her and I feel really connected to so much of her story because I know what it feels like to want to be outside all of the time. So as sad as that is, I think her posts are something beautiful to look at and something I'm sure her son will grow up enjoying because it's such a big window into who she was. Chiaki and Saki would make their way up to the summit of Huascarán over the next 10 days. On their trek, they encountered short, steep slopes up to an angle of about 60 degrees, glaciers that hid deep crevasses, seracs, or tall columns of ice, avalanche debris, and of course, technical climbing over the ice and snow. With their ice axes and crampons attached to their boots, the pair of friends scaled the mountain, and on June 23rd, they reached the summit at 22,205 feet, or 6,768 meters. I don't know if they were able to check the weather, or if they could see how it was changing, but mountains are notorious for making their own weather. And sometime on that day, just as they were descending, the weather began to take a turn. The two got down off the peak and entered an area known as La Garganta, a highly technical part of the mountain between 21,000 and 22,000 feet, or 6,400 and 6,700 meters. That would take a lot of effort to get down even in good conditions, and as they climbed down, the fog rolled in, and a blizzard suddenly covered them in snow. Temperatures dropped rapidly to -22 Fahrenheit or -30 Celsius. Due to the poor visibility and the heavy snowfall, the pair became trapped on the mountain. Thinking on their feet and knowing how dire their situation was, the women pulled out their satellite phone and sent out a distress signal that was quickly picked up by the Peruvian Mountain Guides Association, who quickly put together a rescue team. But the location they were trapped in was rocky and extremely difficult to access, made only harder given the deep snow. With no clear evacuation routes, their only chance of rescue was to move further down the mountain. The only problem was that Chiaki was experiencing hypothermia and couldn't move. The cold was depleting her energy and causing her confusion and difficulty standing. There was no way Chiaki could make the difficult descent. On June 25th, a team of 10 mountain guides made their way up, searching the mountain, braving sub-zero temperatures and high winds to find the women. The operation was made up of High Mountain Rescue Unit officers, Huascarán National Park personnel, Peruvian Mountain Guides Association members, and volunteer team members. Upon locating the lost climbers, they discovered one was alive and the other dead. Chiaki lay on the ground on her back, with her jacket zipped up over her face and not moving as Saki sat beside her. The rescuers urged Saki to move further down the mountain so they could evacuate her via helicopter, but she refused. She would not leave Chiaki's side. Over the course of the previous day, Chiaki's condition had gone from bad to worse. She began to suffer from the lack of oxygen, which caused the cerebral edema, and she slipped further and further towards unconsciousness until, sometime in the night, at the age of 40, leaving behind a husband and toddler, Chiaki slipped away completely. Saki could only look on as her friend deteriorated, and now in shock, although she was also still in danger, she refused to leave without Chiaki's body. On the 26th, around 4 a.m., another rescue team set off from base camp. They reached the two by 3 p.m., and were able to get Saki down the mountain. She was transported to Huaraz, then transferred to the Huaraz hospital, where she was admitted to the trauma shock unit. She had suffered from severe dehydration and frostbite on both hands and feet. When later asked how she'd managed to survive, Saki said she had worn Chiaki's jacket after she'd passed away, and that was probably the only reason that she was still alive. On June 28th, rescuers were finally able to recover Chiaki's body. Chiaki's story holds a strong resemblance to another incident that happened 28 years earlier to another Japanese climber on Mount Everest. 47-year-old Yasuko Namba was the second Japanese woman to ever climb the 7 summits. On May 10, 1996, she reached the summit of Everest, becoming, at the time, the oldest woman to ever do so. But that day, the climbers had caught summit fever and pushed for the peak in spite of the weather warnings from base camp. The guides attempted to aid their team of climbers down from the mountain, but on their descent were caught in a terrible blizzard. It's said that the trek up Everest is difficult, but the descent is even harder. After days of low oxygen, cold, and extreme exertion, it's tempting to push for the summit. But ascents late in the day, combined with exhaustion, led to catastrophic results. On May 11th, Yasuko succumbed to the lack of oxygen and hypothermia on the south col of Everest at 25,938 feet, or 7,906 meters. At somewhere between 90 and 100 pounds, she degraded more rapidly than her fellow climber, Beck Weathers, who also lay trapped on the mountain. While Beck was later able to regain consciousness and managed to walk back to camp, he suffered from severe hypothermia and frostbite, to which he lost his nose, right hand, and some of his forearm and the fingers on his left hand. Both Chiaki and Yasuko made it to the peaks they dreamed of, but in the end, the mountain decided not to let them go. And at the age of 40 and 47 respectively, Chiaki, as a doctor of mountain medicine, and Yasuko, as a member of the 7 Summits Club, had years of experience under their belts and expertise in mountaineering. But none of that made the difference the day they summited. Though a world away, the 2 mountains have a similar message for climbers. At your own risk, prevail to the summit, but remember that the mountain has no friends, no enemies, no room for error. And that's the story of Chiaki's last ascent and the dangers of mountains like Huascarán. I know it's a really sad story, but I hope this doesn't deter anyone from alpine climbing. It's definitely something I could see myself doing in the future, and I really feel like this story and others like Yasuko's actually give me a lot of hope and confidence. It's important to really trust the weather reports when they say the conditions aren't good. In Yasuko's case, that was somewhat unavoidable. They likely still would have been trapped far above base camp on the mountain, but the expedition she was in could probably have survived if they'd stayed at one of the lower camps or turned back instead of summiting. It's so alluring to just keep going when you're already so close, and it costs so much time and money and effort to make it out to Everest, so I can only imagine how defeating it must feel to turn back. But if it's turn back or die on a mountain, I just don't think I love climbing enough to risk that. In Chiaki's case, some authorities speculated that they took a risk by not having a guide with them. I don't think I fully agree with that. While I understand it's useful to have a guide, and certainly one who already knows the mountain and the area, these women were highly experienced, and Chiaki had led people as a guide herself on other peaks. So it's not a theory to toss out the window, but it's definitely not the only thing to consider. What I do think, however, that might be the most important is that a team of 2 just isn't enough for high altitude ascents on such a challenging mountain. Even backcountry backpacking or just hiking, doing that on a trail miles away from the next human with just 2 people is so risky, because if one person gets hurt, then the other has to decide if there's a better chance for them to be rescued if they leave or if they stay. Because now you're having to decide based on your companion's condition, will they die from their injuries or weather or predators if I leave them? Or if we split up, could I get more lost and then rescuers only find one of us, or maybe neither? Like, what if my companion is unconscious and the rescuers walk right by them? Meanwhile, I'm another 30 miles away looking for a road that's not there. Obviously, that's going off on a wild tangent, but these things do happen, and I believe in safety in numbers. So if you're planning to summit, even if it's a much shorter mountain you can hike up, definitely think about getting more friends to go with you, ideally at a skill level to match the ascent, and really pay attention to the weather and your gut. If you're on the mountain and your heart says yes, but your gut says no, you've got to listen to your gut. But it's also a mountain. It doesn't matter what plans we make. Once you're on the mountain, you're on the mountain's schedule. And if it decides to make a storm you didn't plan for, it's just nature. And nature has no ethics, no good or bad. It's not a terrible storm. It's just a storm. And that's where having a guide or someone who knows the area better can definitely benefit your team. And I have one more update on Huascarán. There was a group of 3 friends climbing the mountain in 2002 when an avalanche buried them. At first, only one member, Steve Erksine's body was found, and then 22 years later, in 2024, Bill Stamfel was discovered by other climbers, mummified by the cold after some of the ice around him had melted. The 3rd member of their team, Matthew Richardson, still remains missing. So if you climb that mountain and see something that doesn't look like it should be there, if it's safe, go investigate, because you never know. And the guys who found Bill, Ryan Cooper and Wesley Warren, just thought to take a closer look at this unusual formation, only to find that it was a frozen body. And the thing is that they were descending the mountain at the time because of inclement weather. Obviously, this story in itself kind of disproves what I just said about climbing only with one other person. And that's not to say that it's entirely unsafe. It's just adding a risk in place where there are already a lot of risks. And clearly, Saki mitigated one of those risks by bringing her sat phone, which saved her life. So maybe you're the overcautious friend with a backpack full of extra weight that day, but it could make the difference between going home and staying on the mountain forever. If you're interested in seeing some of Chiaki's boulder sends or learning more about mountain medicine, I highly recommend checking out her and her husband's YouTube channel and watching some of their videos, which I'll link. They're in Japanese, but they have this auto dub feature, which seems to work pretty well. And I say that, but in my research, not on their channel, but on a Peruvian news channel, the auto dub was relaying the news about the recovery of her body, and this menacing cackle kept happening. It was so off-putting and really inappropriate, and I had to turn off the video. I did not like that, so I say use it with caution. Anyway, Chiaki's husband is still running their channel, and he's reposted some of her older videos as well. Her family actually posted the funeral ceremony and spreading of her ashes, and it was so sad but really pretty. I teared up really hard watching, not her husband, who was so impressively brave giving his speech, but this old school friend of hers from college just broke down, and it was really hard to watch him feel that. But I liked seeing the end of her life being celebrated this way, especially after hours and hours getting to know her, just knowing that eventually her story ends in the same way, the way that I found out about her, which was the news story about her death. Her husband spreads the ashes over 2 new trees overlooking a bright green field and mountains in the distance. And I don't know about Japanese funeral practices, but they did something so cool. Inside the house, like at the funeral, I think this was where she lived, were all of her climbing gear all laid out around her climbing board. It was every shoe she wore, all of her clothes, the ropes, the quick draws, harness, the everything that she'd worn and touched 1,000 times. It was like an art piece memorializing her life. It's like when people say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think objects in her life were like that, and it's beautiful that her family shared that not only with everyone there, but online to the climbing community, to people like me on the other side of the planet, inviting us to see Chiaki in a way that an entire book couldn't have told us. I know that was a lot, but I hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks for listening to Stick and Stone. You can follow along to find out about upcoming episodes at Stick and Stone Pod on Instagram. Support the show to get all episodes before the main feed on Patreon. If you want to watch the episodes, head to Stick and Stone Pod on YouTube. Follow the podcast wherever you listen, and leave a rating and review if you like the show. I hope you feel inspired to climb, and remember, always check your knots.